We are sitting at Indianapolis, ACFW, and this is Elizabeth Byler Younts. She is a wonderful new Amish author, and she does it differently. Her book is Promise to Return, brand new novel. It's coming out in October. And I have to tell you, I read it last night and I couldn't put it, I didn't just read it last night. I read it for the last 2 days. And as my roommate said, I could not put it down. It was that good.
Thank you.
It's written completely different than other Amish books. And I think we'll get to why in just a little bit. First of all, let's have you tell us about you.
Well, as far as
Your background.
my background,
How did you get started writing, and why did you write Amish?
well, I was born into an Amish family, and throughout my life, I've always been writing. And as an 11-year-old, I even had my first novel written, handwritten. Will never see the light of day, of course, but writing was always in my heart, in my soul. And growing up with the Amish around me, even though my parents left when I was a preschooler, it was just part of my life. It's my first language. It's really where everything of all the milestones in my life, those are the things that happened were around my, Amish community and my family and my cousins and aunts and uncles. And so,
how many cousins do you have?
I
just have
over 100 first cousins. Yes, and I have an aunt and uncle who they have an infant. So I mean, there's some of them are still having children. So because the families are so spread apart in ages also. So yeah, very, very large family, and it was enjoyable, of course, growing up with all that around me. I was closer with my mom's side, just, by geography. And my grandmother has these fantastic stories, and I always wanted to write her stories. And I told her when I was probably 11 or 12 that someday I would write her life story. And after my first daughter was born, I had that itch again that I had to write this story, because there was so much to say of what she had gone through the Great Depression and her just the different things with World War II when she was young, and then meeting my grandpa when he was also serving in World War II, but as a conscientious objector in a camp. And that always fascinated me because it was something that I never learned in my history classes at school.
Right.
And so I thought, there's something different about this. But it didn't strike me, so unique until I started writing her story. And I chose to self-publish that. It was for my family. And I thought, my family's going to love this, and this is going to be great. And, when the sales started coming in, I thought I was overwhelmed. This was something God put on my heart for me and my family. And, it brought out a different voice that I did not expect with Amish historical. And so my grandmother, who's still Amish, just has a new lease on life. She sells books out of her little apartment. She has the Red Hat Society coming out to see her, and she's like a stop now on their little, the Red Hat Society little traveling things that they do, and they stop there and they just sit by her hickory rocker and they listen to more stories. So it really has been fascinating to watch all this unfold, and that's really what brought on this idea of Amish historical. I started thinking, what's appealing about this? Because I really had no intention of writing Amish fiction. I felt like there's so much of it out there. There's so many Amish fiction writers. What's a different story that I would tell anyway? And
you tell it from such a different perspective.
Well, thank you. But when I started thinking about the history of it, and no one had heard about the civilian public service camps and what happened to the conscientious objectors during World War II and World War I, and there's very little out there about the Amish during any of the war times.
It's true.
And so I just found Miriam and Henry were in my head, and I just started writing their story. And
now, is Miriam your grandmother?
No, my grandmother is Lydia.
Okay.
And I came up with Miriam and Henry purely because I loved those names. And come to find out, my grandmother has friends who are Miriam and Henry masked, which is kind of funny that I did not know that. But so she was very proud of that. But she is, as a sweet Amish grandmother, could not be prouder of her very non-Amish granddaughter, just telling these stories that she has told me. And this story is fiction, but there's still so much of it that's weaved through of what I've grown up with, and it's coming from this, I don't want to say behind closed doors, because
That's
those
exactly
doors were never
how,
closed to me. Those doors are my doors. So
that is how I described it to my roommate, that you're writing it from the inside out.
right.
Instead of you're writing from the supper table inside the house.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so different than any other Amish author that I've ever read. And I've read a lot. So it just resonated integrity and depth on a level and a plane that I have not seen for a long time. So
Thank you.
that is, and so this is exciting. This is very, very exciting. What made your parents decide not to continue being on Amish? That's a tough one.
It is. They were, most of their life, they lived in Canada. They were both born in the States. Around the Vietnam era, they had sons who would have been draftable. And not to make this a political thing, but they really didn't. After what my grandfather went through with World War II, they really didn't want to go through that again. So they moved to Canada. There was droves of the Amish that moved to Canada. So they lived there about 17 years. So when my parents, they were engaged young, married young, and they had my sister in Canada, and then they moved down to Michigan when they were expecting me. And a few years when they were in Michigan, they built their own house. And people ask me what are my memories of being Amish, and one of the biggest things is I just remember it was dark in our house. We just didn't have electric lights, and I remember the horse and buggy. And I remember my first non-Amish dress, which I wasn't supposed to bring out when my grandma was home, and of course I did. So I was probably 3 or 4 when my parents were witnessed to by a Baptist minister, and they were told about salvation, and it was something they actually had not heard before, and in the form and the terminology that the pastor was able to deliver to them. And there are different districts, they do things differently. My parents had never been taught salvation, and so my mom has I've talked to my mom more about it than my dad, and my mom says she would pillow her head at night and she would wonder, did I do enough today? And that was something that, was on her soul. And it was a good God question, but she had no resolution of that until this Baptist minister started talking to them. And it did not take long for them to see what God had for them. And they made a very brave decision. We lived across the street from my grandparents and my grandmother, the one that is focused in the memoir. And they started going to a Baptist church. We were dressed Amish, we looked Amish, but they had a heart change and they accepted Christ. And it completely changed the course of our family.
Now, were they shunned?
They were shunned. At that point, my dad's family lived in the Dover, Delaware area. So there were, bishops and preachers coming from the east, all the way, from Michigan. They were coming to our doorstep, asking us and pleading with us not to leave. And if you know my parents and how loyal they are and how just faithful they are to their family, it would really shock you that they were able to make such a decision. So it was God's strength and really God giving them those answers to do that. And there's no amount of appreciation that I have for that, because I mean, how do you explain that? I mean, that changed the course of my life, And it's not to say that there aren't Amish people who know salvation and have asked for forgiveness of their sins and accepted Christ. That's not at all what I'm saying. But for them, it had not happened in the Amish church. This was what God's, path for them was. So, and for me, I believe that was revolutionary. And I'm so thankful for my heritage, and I'm thankful for my parents making that brave decision.
That's well said. Now, you have here Henry and Miriam. Mm-hmm. She struggled and was forced in her thinking she was struggling with a tremendous conflict between staying with the Amish community and her love for Henry, and having the counter of Eli involved in the relationship. How did you come up with the characters and what their roles were in the book?
Because it's a wartime, I think that I actually came up imagining the male protagonist first. So in my mind, I think I really saw Henry first, imagining that, I mean, my grandpa was drafted, so I had heard those stories throughout my growing up, and imagining what if he had decided that instead of, staying with the safe, conscientious, objective view, as far as safety for himself,
Right.
physical safety, but going and saying, you know what, I don't think that that's my view. And that's what Henry does, is he sees himself that he might be a loyal Amish person, but he has a different view on pacifism, and that he does feel that it is our obligation to help those in need, and that may mean to go to war. And I think God calls us to a variety of things that we don't expect. So does God call us to war? Does God call a person to war? And I think that's something each person has to seek. And in Henry's mind, in Henry's heart, that's what he seeks the Lord. And he chooses to act on something that will rock the community. And it's not something that, I don't think that in my mind in writing him, that's not what he expected. But he knew that he had to follow his calling.
And
so
Miriam,
that is what he does.
How did you...
And
that was a very complex characterization.
Right. Miriam, anytime I, think of a man leaving for war, I'm a military wife, so you automatically wonder, who's he leaving behind? And this story came up right on the cusp of my husband's first deployment.
Oh.
And so there was a lot of personal emotion that did entangle in this. And World War II and the war we're experiencing now, they're very different. I got to email my husband. I got to Skype him. I got to text him even. So I didn't experience what Miriam would have, or other women in World War II. But there's still some of those similar emotions that you can feel what they may have experienced in some way. And Miriam, to me, was someone who, she had never really had to be brave. She, had to follow the long line of siblings ahead of her. She had a dream in mind, and her dream was really very practical for an Amish girl. She wanted to get married and have a family, live on a farm, and marry Henry. And when that was completely altered, she had to become brave, and she had to decide what really does she want? Where does her heart land?
Now, is this going to be a series? Is this a standalone book? It's going to be a series.
It's a 3-book series.
Okay.
But
the name of the series is
The Promise of Sunrise.
Okay.
And each book could be read separately. There's a couple of tie-in characters for book 1 and book 2. Book 3 is even more of a standalone.
Okay, on a personal level, who's in book 2?
Book 2 is Eli's story. So at the end of the book, or toward the end,
he goes to the conscientious objector
camp. Yes, he goes to the CPS, and so his story is very much in line with what my grandpa experienced. And my grandpa was in the labor camps, and then he went to the mental institution. And that's where he worked that's when he met my grandma. She was not in the mental institution, but they were, in a bus route proximity. So he would basically visit, he'd heard about her, and he'd visit my grandma. And that's where they fell in love, when he was working at the mental institution. So this book 2 highlights when Eli works at a mental institution and meets a beautiful nurse named Christine.
Wow. Now, how did you get started in the publishing, at becoming published?
Well, a few years ago, it must have been about maybe 5 years ago. Like I said, I've always been writing. I've always wanted to write fiction, but I also always knew I was going to write this nonfiction memoir for my grandmother. About 5 years ago, I felt this calling in my heart that I was supposed to write for the Christian market. And before that, I had just thought, I'm going to be a writer. I hadn't really given it much consideration, ABA, CBA. I really didn't even know about those acronyms. I was just going to be a writer. And so once I started feeling that calling, anytime, from just my personality, if I feel led by something, it can be something small or big, I cannot just sit back and ponder it. I am probably more proactive than I need to be in some ways, and I Google everything. So once I really felt strongly about this, and I felt God was being very direct with me in my head, I just Googled, what kind of Christian writing is there? Are there groups? What's out there for this? Because I, really wasn't sure. I didn't read a lot of CBA at the time. And a lot of the CBA that I did read was in college. And since then, I had just found other authors that I had enjoyed. And so I found the ACFW and located Eileen Key, who was the chapter president in the Southwest region, and I was in San Antonio at the time. So I contacted her, and she said, well, you're in luck because Allison Pittman has an amazing critique group only, a few miles from your home. So I walked into that critique group not knowing anything about the CBA, and I met Allison, who is fantastic and has this amazing, huge personality, and wrote things that I'm like, I related with that. I was expecting something different out of CBA from what I remembered in college that really is so different from what it is now.
Absolutely.
And
it has changed.
It has changed so much, and I think it's changed for the better.
Absolutely.
I think it can reach a vast amount of people. And so I became really excited about this calling that God has put on my heart, and so glad that I didn't shut that out, because God really made sure that I didn't shut it out, I guess. He talked loudly enough. And so I started, chatting with her and bringing my chapters to get critiqued and accepting the criticism. And,
That's key.
It is. And I learned so much in just the critique group alone. I'd never taken a writing class. And I actually struggled in English even with some of just the grammar things like diagramming sentences. And I thought, I'm never going to be a writer because I can't diagram a sentence. But I started learning about writing and structure and so many things from her group. And so then I started writing the memoir and taking that into group every week. And then because my grandma was 85 and she had pneumonia at the time, I'm like, I have to self-publish this before. I don't know who publishes anything like this. And my family has, been talking to me about, for a decade at least, when is that going to happen? When is this going to happen? So I started, I thought, I'm going to do this. I had that was like maybe about a few weeks before my first ACFW conference.
Mm-hmm.
And so I brought a few books, and, a few people were interested, and I started talking to a few agents, letting them know just what I'm doing, and they were interested, and they wanted sales numbers and things like that. And I thought, well, I've got those because I'm the only one in this project. I don't have a publisher. And I didn't want to republish. I wanted to move forward. Fiction was where my heart was. And there were just, there was some interest in the fact that it was historical and it was Amish. And so once I started developing that idea, there was a couple agents that wanted to see A Promise to Return. And once I was able to get that out, it went very quickly. I met with Natasha Kern last year. She offered to represent me when I met her, and she had it sold in like 6 weeks. It was a whirlwind.
You and God did a great job selling it, because I was sitting here last night reading, listen to this, listen to the words that she's writing, and you write elegantly and simply. And,
thank you.
It's just amazing how God took your words and your background and everything you are passionate about and came up with this book. It was just really astounding. You mentioned that you're in a critique group. Do you have a critique partner?
Well, I moved away from San Antonio, so that made it difficult to do, because Allison Pittman critiques her. I mean, she is an invaluable person, and she critiques every week with like 7 or 8 other writers. So I thought, well, that might be a lot for her to handle. This book that I'm working on right now is the 3rd book in the series, and we will be working together again, because I just love having a critique partner, and I wasn't able to do that with book 2 just because of different schedules.
Uh-huh.
So I am going to be working with her again, and we're actually moving to Hershey, Pennsylvania in about 12 days.
Really?
And that is a God thing, too. We did not anticipate this happening. My husband's actually leaving active duty and going into the National Guard. And Hershey,
Great.
Pennsylvania opened wide open for us. And there's...
Lancaster is right next to Hershey.
Exactly. And
so you have plenty of fodder for
right.
writing.
Right.
And
there's good groups are there.
Right.
Yes.
You have a great group of people there.
Very good. Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So I'm really excited about our move and being able to actually one-on-one and face-to-face be with other writers, because in my area in Alabama there just weren't that opportunity didn't exist as much. So I'm very excited about that.
One of the writers that I wanted you to read the book is from Hershey, Pennsylvania.
Oh my goodness!
So we'll have a chance
Absolutely.
to introduce. Hopefully, we'll be able to introduce you.
That would be
Wouldn't
great.
That fun?
Oh, that'd be just fantastic.
Now, one of the things I was also wondering is, what are some of the challenges that you face as an author?
Funny you should mention that. I have 2 young children, 2 daughters. They're 6 and 3.
Ooh, there you go.
Yes. So, and we homeschool. And, and homeschooling, I feel as led to homeschool as I do to be an author. And so God has been able to bless us with, just a really fun time homeschooling, first grader. And my 3-year-old she's always along for the ride. That's her personality. And she says she reads, and she has a lot of fun. So we do that most of the time during the mornings, and then after they go to bed is really when I get to work. And then on the weekends, depending on how close I'm to a deadline, it might be every Saturday or every other Saturday, depending on where we're at and what's happening in the book. Sometimes I just feel like I need to complete this section before I can take a break. And there are times where I'll have a babysitter come in for the day and take some time away from the house to work during the week. And I did that more this summer, which was really helpful. So, God has a plan in that, and it has not always been easy. And that's when I call my agent up and, she can remind me that this is a season and, this is okay, that I'm busy and we'll make it work. So, it's one of those things that I know that this season of life in writing is a difficult combo, but that makes me just depend on the Lord more. And I think that is a huge reason why he brought it into my life right now, because I can be fairly independent and stubborn. So I think he's teaching me some valuable lessons. And I'm very structured. And now I can be, but I almost have to be more flexible so that God can work through me. So.
Oh, that's neat. Now, what is the one thing that people probably don't know about you? That's a tough one, I know.
That is a tough one. I don't read a lot because I don't have time. So I think people are surprised when they know that I don't read as much as I'd like to. I'm a closet DIYer. I love to, if you stand still long enough in my house, you're going to get painted. And so I love to repurpose furniture. If I wasn't a writer, I think that's what I would do. So, I love things like that. I love photography. So, and I used to crochet until I just lived to crochet for the longest time when my first was born, especially. So, some of those little things, I guess. I'm not sure there's any big things.
That's good. No, that's exactly the fact that you're a closet painter.
Yes,
that's
I love to
exciting.
DIY.
Now, what do you do to get away from it all since you have such a busy schedule?
My husband and I have in-home dates every Friday night. And so the girls, we always try to get them to bed about 30 minutes early. Thinking that little 30 minutes gives us extra time in the evenings. So, and then we'll watch a movie or watch some type of show that we enjoy. And we don't eat with the girls. We, give them their meal and we sit and chat with them. But then as soon as they're in bed, we prepare our own meal. Sometimes we'll make something that the kids wouldn't really appreciate that much anyway. And then we just sit and enjoy each other and have our in-home date. And that has become a real tradition for us now. And most Friday nights, that's what we're doing. And so that is a huge release for us and to enjoy each other.
Huge. Oh, what a great idea. Now, one of the things I wanted to also mention is last night we had at our dinner, it was a costume dinner, and it was supposed to represent your book or something about your book. Now, you had an interesting costume last night that didn't necessarily represent Amish.
No.
So, can you explain that a little bit?
Sure.
Okay.
So, I wore a 40s-inspired black dress with a 40s-inspired hat or a fascinator. And I looked online. Obviously I've done so much research on what people, especially the women, wore in the 40s. And since my book, too, has a protagonist that is actually a non-Amish woman, I decided to channel her instead of coming as in an Amish attire. And I've always been fascinated with vintage clothing, and unfortunately I wasn't able to get a real vintage dress. Those are pretty pricey, but I really had fun with it, and I loved the red lipstick, and And it was a lot of fun, and I hope
And
they
you
do
look
that again.
great.
Well,
I
thank
thought
you.
that was fun.
I did get
Really
a couple
fun.
of looks, like they'd look down at my badge and it says Amish Historical, and they'd give me a little, and then some people were, they just asked me, and so I was able to explain that one of my protagonists isn't Amish.
Oh,
so
that is
then
neat.
it made a little more sense to people.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time out to do this interview.
Well, thank you
with
for
us.
inviting me. This has been fantastic.
I am excited. I'm excited to watch your career grow. I think you are a marvelous writer, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time.
Well, thank you so much. This has been such a privilege, and thank you for your compliments, and I'm just going to tuck them away and pull them out when I feel discouraged.
Well, you shouldn't, because it's a great book.
Well, thank you.
Take care.